we enter into the Friday of his Passion Week. It is the day of courts and cobblestone and crosses. A day of courts, both crooked and clean. A day of cobblestone paths of suffering. A day of crosses and death outside the city. Where we left off in the dark midnight hours of Thursday night into Friday morning, Jesus had led his disciples out to the garden where he prayed and he waited for the moment that he knew was coming, where he'd be betrayed into the hands of sinners. Who knew that he would be betrayed by one of his own? That the hands of the dirtiest of sinners were the most religious among us. It was the day of courts. The religious courts were a sham. They were illegal. They were by religious leaders. They had no real authority. They were held in haste. They were secret. They were in the middle of the night with conflicting testimonies. Yet the religious leaders were so bent on ridding this world of Jesus that they agreed to the charge, blasphemy, because he admitted to being the Christ, the Son of the living God, which first of all is not even a crime if you are the Christ, if you are the Son of the living God, but even to the law of the land. It's not a real crime. It's a religious concept that the religious people worry about. It's not a real law. But to get the deed done, they would need the law of the land. They would need the Romans to sign off on it, to give the actual go-ahead to kill Jesus. So by the time that we have entered Friday in Mark chapter 15, we discover that very early in the morning, the whole assembly of religious leaders had come together and they had made their plans. They bound Jesus and they led him away and they handed him over to Pilate. Now the courts of Pilate and other gospels describe even more hearings, but Mark just reports the main hearing before Pilate. And those courts, during business hours, they are legit courts. They are designed to investigate for criminal activity, to determine guilt or innocence. And Pilate goes right at the accused, gets right at the heart of the matter. Jesus, are you claiming to be who they say that you are claiming to be, the King of the Jews? Jesus says, you have said it, and you've said it true. He admits to this title, but Pilate realizes it's just like a spiritual kingship Jesus is talking about among a people whose kingdom is long extinct. He's not out to overthrow anything. This guy is harmless. So the chief priests pick up on that and they accuse him of more things, many more things. And so Pilate asks him, aren't you going to answer their charges? Do you see all that they are accusing you of? But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. What was he amazed at? It was like Jesus was okay with where this was going. He had already resigned himself to be guilty of being the Christ, of being the Son of God, of being the King of the Jews. It was like he readily admitted being the end of the physical temple and the beginning of something newer, something better, something more from God. Like he's already resigned to the sacrifice and being the sacrifice of God. Or as Jesus had already said, being the ransom for many. Pilate is thinking, if the accused is not going to help his own defense, then the court is going to step in and provide a loophole. And the crowd's loophole and the court's loophole was a ransom, a payment for the release of a prisoner. You see, it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. You know, a ransom of the people for the people. Pilate had an idea. There's this violent man called Barabbas who he's in prison for the worst crimes, murder. So when the crowd came up and asked for him to do for them what he usually did at this time of year, Pilate put two choices before the people. Here is the real lawbreaker for the worst crimes ever, the murderous Barabbas, running free among you and your families, free to murder again. Or I give you no record, righteous Rabbi Jesus. Pilate's idea is a good idea. Like, watch this. People, do you want me to release Barabbas? Or do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? Because he knew that Jesus was being set up by the chief priests. That this was all a hoax to rid themselves of Jesus. But to his surprise, the chief priests stirred up that crowd to have them release murderous Barabbas instead. Pilate did not see that coming. Wait, people, you are not making sense. What shall I do? What shall I do with this one that you call the King of the Jews? The people, many of whom probably shouted Jesus' praise as King last Sunday, shouted, "Crucify him!" today. And listen closely. Pilate says, "Why? What crime has he committed?" Which is huge. Pilate's court was skilled in discovering innocence or guilt. So what he's saying here is this, that Jesus was tried. He even admitted to the charge of being the King of the Jews, but the court's highest voice declares this, that the case against Jesus had not been proven. By the court's estimation, he had committed no crime. Jesus was innocent, and the courts declared it. But the crowd, they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" And wanting to satisfy the crowd, to keep the peace among the people, Pilate released Barabbas to them and had innocent Jesus flogged and handed over to be crucified. He who had promised to be the ransom for sinners had just become the ransom paid for one, and one of the worst of sinners. And he who had come offering peace and peace with God was being set on a course to his death as a way to keep the peace among the people. It was the day of cobblestone, for he was set on a cobblestone course, a path of suffering like no other. This suffering was torture. Pilate's courts, they had Jesus flogged, which means he is stripped. He is tied to a post, his neck and his back exposed, a whip made of several tails, each tail with a stone in the end of it, a shard of glass tied into it, and it's raised up and it is thrown full force on his back, not with a whipping motion, right? But stones, they hit and they bruise, they soften the skin so the glass shards can puncture in like grapple hooks. And once in, yank the back, tearing out the back and the muscle and lashes. 40 lashes of this were known to kill a man. And so a flogging was 39. By then, ribbons of flesh and muscle are just hanging off his back. Blood is everywhere. This is the physical torture of the worst kind, meant to submit a man, bend his will, get him to say or do anything, to keep the torture from continuing. If anyone could have intervened and stopped this, Jesus could. But he didn't. He continued to endure the physical and psychological torture. The soldiers who had bruised, battered, and bloodied Jesus to the point of his death made him now get up on your feet and led him walking away into the praetorium. And they called together the whole company of the soldiers, and they pressed a heavy purple robe on his ribboned back. And then they twisted together a crown of thorns and pressed it on his head. And they began to call out to him, "Hail, hail, King of the Jews." Again and again, they struck him on his head and with their staff, and they spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him in mockery. And by the time they were done mocking him, the blood of Jesus' back had clotted into the heavy robe, and they rip it off, opening up his wounds anew. And they put his own clothes back on him to clot some more. And then they led him further along this cobblestone path, now out to crucify him on a cross, the size of a railroad tie. The cross was heavy for even a strong man to carry. Jesus had been beaten and bloodied to death, so there is no way that he could carry it. The soldiers look around, and a certain man from Cyrene, Simon, who was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him carry the cross because Jesus cannot. It was heavy, and it was excruciating. When they brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull, because it looked like a skull, they even offered him wine mixed with myrrh, anything. It's like a drug, anything to dull the excruciating pain of the crucifixion, where your hands and your feet are nailed into a cross, and lifted up and dropped in a hole. And you droop just enough that to take a breath, you have to lift yourself, pushing against the nail in your feet, and pulling up on the nails in your hand, scraping your raw and ribboned back against the coarse wood, just for one breath. And then over and over and over again, excruciating, and yet he did not take the drug to dull the pain. He who could have stopped it in an instant took on the pain of the cross and the humiliation of the cross. When they crucified him, they stripped him of his clothes. He was probably crucified naked for all to see, bruised and bloodied and grotesque. They divided up his clothes, even cast lots to see what pieces of clothing each one of them would get. The cross was so humiliating, and it was a sentence. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. And the written notice on the charge against him, it read, "The King of the Jews." He did admit to that. So though Pilate had declared him innocent of any real crime, they had to give some reason for his crucifixion. Because you can't just go around condemning innocent men to the worst torture and the worst pain. And so the promised king, the Messiah king, the king of all creation and the king of the Jews, he is crucified for admitting who he was, that he was a king. That was the charge, and that was the sentence. But it doesn't matter that we can decipher and we can discern the charges. The cross was a shame, no matter how you reasoned it out. For where they crucified him, known criminals were crucified on both sides of him, crucified on his right and on his left. There was no, oh, but there's the good one. No. If you were crucified, you were assumed guilty. You were assumed deserving of everyone's mockery. The citizens who passed by, they hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, so you who are going to destroy the temple and build it up in 3 days, come down from that cross and save yourself. The religious leaders, they mocked him among themselves. He saved others, right? He can't even save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe. Even the criminals on both sides of him also heaped insults on him. The one who had so long been the beloved hero of the people was being condemned and mocked and humiliated from every side. The cross was the worst kind of isolation. All he had left was his Father. But 3 hours into his crucifixion at noon, this darkness came over the whole land for hours. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Have you left me too? It is the deep cry of the soul when all is stripped away. It is the hardest lament of all when we feel abandoned by God as well. If anyone would have ever felt that feeling, it would have been Jesus. If you've ever felt alone or abandoned even by God, Jesus knows what that feels like more than you know. He cried that kind of cry that wrecks us inside. It was such a heart-wrenching cry that it causes even the most hardened hearts to melt. Because some of those who had been standing near, they probably had been mocking him. But when they heard him cry out this cry to God, why have you abandoned me? They said, listen, he is calling Elijah. He's actually calling him. And a man ran and he filled a sponge with vinegar and wine, put it on a staff, offered it up to Jesus to drink. And he turned to everyone, now leave him alone. Let's see if maybe Elijah does come and take him down. The cross was torture. It was heavy. It was excruciating. It was humiliating. It was isolating. But the end purpose of the cross and the crucifixion was a slow but sure death. And with one last loud cry, Jesus breathed his last breath. He died. It was over. It was finished. Whatever it was done. For there is nothing left to be done after death. When death comes, and it takes away everything. It takes away life. It closes the book. It ends the story. If he was a ransom, that's over. If he was an offer of peace, it's gone. It's off the table. If he is the Christ King, then the Christ King is killed. Son of God or Son of Man, it doesn't matter when he's dead. Death is the finish. No more. Done. But what was done? Something more was done. At the very same time as he cried out his last cry and he breathed his last breath, and the very same time that Jesus died, that is right when the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And it's the very time when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus and saw how he died, he said, "Surely this man is the Son of God." In the cross of Christ, there was something more. The curtain that had long separated God's place inside the Holy of Holies and His people's place outside of it had been torn in two. That does not happen by accident. And Gentile of Gentiles, hard, calloused Roman soldiers there calls Jesus Son of God, the Son of the living God. There is something more that is happening in this crucifixion. They could not see it clearly that day, but they saw something. Something that is tearing apart the long separation between God and people. Something that is waking up and calling out in all people and drawing them. There in that day, they could not see what we can see. All they see before them was a sentence meted out, the road of pain and anguish, the end of the line, the curtain call of death. There was nothing that they could call good about that Friday, in that Friday. This was the end of all hope and the beginning of all despair. But there were glimpses that something more was happening and had happened there. What it was a mystery for them that day. What it was is the secret we know in the deepest of places. And I don't want to tell you what the good it was that was done. I have a feeling you already know. But today, like those disciples, I want you to sit in the palm of His death. I want you to meditate on His demise. I want you to feel the darkness of His death on that day. And to do that, I want you to take a walk. You've been cooped up in your house. As an individual or as a family, I want you to just take a walk. It can be a short walk. His walk from the courts of Pilate to the cross of Calvary was less than a third of a mile. Just a few blocks. Or maybe it can be a longer walk. His walk from His arrest in the garden, there into the courts, and out to the crucifixion was a mile. But on this day that He walked through courts of condemnation, over cobblestone paths of pain and anguish, up hills to be hung on a cross to die, walk. And as you walk, I want you to think about the road that He chose to walk. The pain and the humiliation He endured. The death that He died for something more, something better. He was doing something, and that something was for you. So take a walk with Him and think about His walk. Weep about His walk and thank Him for His walk. And on your walk, or when you get back from your walk, I want you to create a cross of your own. It may just be 2 nails from your tool drawer strung together with wire. It may be 2 sticks that you find out in your yard or along the way, and you tie them together with rope or string. It may be lumber from your garage, nailed or screwed together. Maybe it takes its place in your altar of coats, or maybe it's erected in a corner of your home or somewhere in your yard. Tonight I want you to walk to remember. Walk to remember His walk, and build a cross to remember His. His cross was something more. There was something more to the story. Yes, we know the rest of the story. But they didn't. That's why we will meet one last time on Saturday, on the darkest day. The day when there is absolutely no hope left. But we who sit on the other side of these days, we have a hope, my friends, because there is more to the story, and we know it. Where will you be on Sunday to hear the greatest news ever discovered? If you are in Lakeland, we would love for you to check out legacychristian.com for more information about our drive-in Easter at 9:30 and 11 in the field at Legacy Christian Church. It is CDC and city approved, or you can catch it on Facebook Live in your own home. But it will be the new day. The most amazing discovery, the best news ever. There was something more going on that day. But for now, go take a walk and go build a cross and think about his walk and his cross.